All right, we're going to get started. Is that on? Hello? Is that on?
Yeah. I think it is. Tap it.
Well, it's yours. Try 85. Okay. Thanks for coming. The study committee is formed pursuant to House Resolution 1667, which called for the members of the study committee to be Chairman of Appropriations, who is en route and should be here any moment, Chairman of Ways and Means, Chairman O'Neill, Speaker Pro Tem Burkhalter is here, and Speaker Emeritus Coleman, and myself. The real purpose behind the study committee, and we're just going to meet today, is to discuss and hear from various members of the agencies on behalf of the House if there is merit to changing the date of the fiscal year of the state to coincide with the federal, which I believe is October 1st. Speaker Emeritus Coleman, who served as distinguished chairman of appropriations for many years in this body, I'm going to ask him, if he would, to start our meeting with just some background to some of his thoughts in this area, which really sort of originated us taking an afternoon to look at this, and then we'll hear from some of our agency people. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, the concept of coinciding the state fiscal year with the federal fiscal year started with a gentleman named Pete Hackney. Many of you might remember Pete, who was legislative budget officer for us in the legislature for maybe 30 years. Started out when Lester Maddox was governor under George L. Smith, and he was the only employee at the time, and he had an ad machine at the time. I think it was a manual adding machine when he started the legislative budget office. But he often sat down in his office after the session was over and had these ideas, and almost all of them were good. This may be one that, depending on the will of the committee, Mr. Chairman and members, turns out to be good or bad, just depending on how you hear the discussion you hear and the testimony you hear. Pete told me about 3 reasons that he felt it would be good. First of all, he felt that coinciding with the federal fiscal year always gave us an even start with federal money. Even though Congress hardly ever meets the deadline for passing authorization bills, they all are effective on October 1. Mr. Chairman, how you doing? They're all effective on October 1, which makes bookkeeping a little easier when some state agencies and quasi-state agencies depend on the federal fiscal year and federal grants and federal funding. Most notably, the school systems, the university system, the technical colleges, and community affairs to some degree with CDBG money, Labor Department, many agencies that depend heavily on federal money might be better served. That's something that this committee would have to determine after that, but that was one of the major reasons. The second reason that we discussed, and that seemed to be an overriding reason, not overriding, but another major reason, was that it gave the agencies, and quite frankly the legislature, more time after the session ended in either March or early April, depending on the end of the session, more time to plan for and prepare a budget for the following fiscal year, and maybe even to some degree would be able to lessen the need for or the impact of the amended general budget, supplemental as it's called right now. Well, there's a third reason that the legislature might be more interested, and that the folks in the audience may not be so interested, and that is that any time you can shake up the bureaucracy and the legislature can get a better handle on what's going on, that's always a good reason to do something. And these folks are here all year. The legislature is here 3 months out of the year in active session, and maybe like you guys, leaders in the majority now are here weekly, but generally the members of the legislature are just here during the session and for of the meetings. Now, the folks sitting out in this audience, the majority of them today are here year-round, and they got time all year to plan how they can snooker you on budgets, how they can get more money out of you, and how they actually do that legitimately and legally. Dan knows, and all of you guys know that. So I guess there are kind of three reasons. First of all, as I said, coincide with the federal fiscal year. Secondly, to give more time after the legislature leaves to analyze a budget and prepare a budget for the following year. And then, of course, third, just the ability, so to speak, to clean out the closet and get ready for your next season for clothes, or just to clean out the closet and get started over again. Mr. Chairman, I think those are some of the reasons that Mr. Hackney and to some degree Mr. Hobbs discussed it over the years. We never did it, but I'm not sure it wouldn't be a good time, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about it, and I think it's worthy of discussion. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Any questions from members of the committee for Speaker Coleman? Speaker Coleman, one of the things that has come to my attention since we did this was, I guess one of the primary reasons for the midterm adjustments because of the adjustment in public school enrollment. With public schools starting earlier and early now, some of them late July, that by the time we get back here in January to adjust for those numbers. How do you see that if we go to an October fiscal date for the budget? How would that be impacted?
I'd have to rely on Charlie, but I think the midterm adjustment figures come in October, don't they?
We will know this year we have two problems. We have, I think, a draft that will $1 million, so we will have $178 million.
Well,
but we do have our reserves, like I said. We're setting aside 1% of the previous year's collection.
Well, to answer your question more directly would be that I don't know that it would make any difference either way on the midterm adjustment, because the school systems have to have those numbers in, and you generally have to fund them in January anyway. Nobody can ever completely and reasonably and exactly predict those numbers, so you got to do it anyway, I would assume. Whether fiscal year's in July 1 or October 1.
Any other questions for Speaker Coleman? All right. What we're going to do today then, we have a number of the agency people here. We're going to call on them. We're going to ask you, we've allotted 15 minutes. That does not mean you need the whole 15 minutes. If it takes you 2 or 3, that's even better. Then we'll allow questions and input from the chairman. If you would, when we recognize you, come up so that we can see. First, from the Department of Education, Scott Austin is here from the Department of Education.
Good afternoon. You can just come right up here, John. I think that'd be technical questions. I appreciate y'all meeting to discuss this. And Mr. Speaker, if I may address that last question, which related to the midterm count, I would confirm what your conclusion, which is it probably wouldn't make any difference. Currently, the budget is set in March, or set in February, March during the legislative process. So the beginning budget is already set prior to the students even showing up. In September, in many cases August, and as a result, we have to make an adjustment based on the FTE count in October. So even if the fiscal year were to start in October, we would still need to make a midterm adjustment. I'm not sure that moving the fiscal year would ameliorate the requirement for a supplemental budget, specifically as it relates to student growth, unless perhaps there are other technical aspects of this that I'm not considering that relate to how we would set the budget and how we would project the number of students at the beginning. And I really didn't have a lot of formal comments. I will be relatively brief, but I would say that I do appreciate the consideration. For us, federal funding is a little over 12% of our budget. It's about $1 billion. The difficulties that we have, unfortunately, would not be greatly improved with changing the fiscal year for the state to be commensurate with the fiscal year for the feds, in that our grant awards typically come down in July. So not only are they not in October, they come down in July. And the feds, even though they have their fiscal year in October, the feds are really geared toward, and this is my assumption, they're geared toward what is nationally a September start, August-September start. And so they try to get the funds down in July. The grant awards, that's when we receive our notification of how much money comes in. And that's really, I think, the most problematic part for us. And it's really accounting. It's not a big problem, but it's from an accounting perspective what I think you all would be concerned about, which is how do we make sure we have the right representation of the beginning budget as it relates to the federal funds that were coming down. In that sense, if we were to receive our grant awards in October, we would probably have visibility into that and be able to provide you all with a very good estimate of what those numbers would be. The reality is that because we don't get our money until July, we don't really, I don't see changing the date by several months really assisting us in helping you to understand what those beginning balances are. What we do as a practical matter is we have to amend the federal budgets. We start the beginning of the year budgets as it relates to federal funding with what we had in the previous year, and then we make an amendment for certainty when we receive the awards, and we amend up and down. To the extent that we're told by the feds that a grant award would be changing with any specificity, then we relay that to the relevant budget offices, but that's often not the case. Oftentimes there are appropriations and then there are a lot of discussions, and the feds will put up a website and say this is how much we think you're going to get, and oftentimes it's frankly less, and so we don't really have a lot of confidence or knowledge in what the number would be. So I do appreciate the consideration of how it might help. From the Department of Education's perspective, I don't think that it would help us in certainty of the beginning budget numbers. Perhaps more problematically, although it's maybe the intent of your number 3, Mr. Speaker, which is to shake up the bureaucracy. Academically speaking, again, the country is relatively geared toward a September start. A lot of our systems in Georgia are actually starting in August, which is to say they're not going toward October, they're going away from them. They're going earlier than October. And so if we were to shift the fiscal year, the state, the local systems, it's our understanding, would be required or would likely have to shift their fiscal years as well. So the local school systems would need to move their fiscal year. Their fiscal year then would start 2, maybe 3 months after the academic year has already started. That problem would be compounded by the issue of our modified accounting requirement in the state of Georgia, wherein the teacher, and I'll answer any questions, but I just want to give you a big picture, and I can answer any detailed questions. But in modified accrual, our teacher contracts run 12 months. The fiscal year starts July 1st, but under modified accrual, there are 2 months of the previous year's contracts that are still paid out by the systems contractually. That is to say, even if a teacher leaves a school system for the work she performed in the previous year, the school system still owes her money for July and August, because September 1st is contractually when we start the contracts, and that's when the funding is geared. That being the case, the school systems are having to fund in July and August for the previous 2 months. And if the fiscal year started in October, there could be some additional slippage in when, and I don't know that we'd have to sit down and talk through it, but there could be some additional slippage in terms of when we would have a finalized budget for the new fiscal year. If the new fiscal year starts in October, I'm not sure how we get funding back to them to cover September. So you now have a July problem, an August problem, and a September problem from a cash flow perspective. And again, I'm just pointing this out big picture, and we could talk through it. So that would be, I think, our primary concern would be just, I think parents are geared towards September. I think anybody is open to consideration of changing the budget. But in this case, it's not just the fiscal side. It's more the academic side, where the school systems are pretty much geared towards September. And I know contractually we do have these 12-month contracts, and there would be some difficulty in accomplishing that payment in September.
Speaker Coleman, I believe you have a question.
Well, assuming that what you say is exactly right, and I'm sure it is, if a teacher is paid on the 12-month contract, which all of them are not, they're paid over 12 months, paid on a 9-month basis, paid over 12 months, it still splits a fiscal year. The question is, strategically, or the way you'd have to do it anyway, if you changed it, the fiscal year, to October, you still would split the fiscal year, no matter.
That is correct, Mr. Speaker, and in that respect, maybe cash flow is not as big an issue as the modified accrual part of this, which is to say that under modified accrual, the systems are allowed to recognize certainty of revenue. The revenue that they would not be able to recognize would be tax receipts. And so currently we have systems that have problems with their surplus, and this is just a technical accounting point, but they have problems with their surplus because they can recognize the revenue for the state dollars that they know are coming in because it's quantifiable and it's certain. They don't know how much money they're going to receive for the tax receipts. And so you would be taking what is a 2-month problem, at least from this technical accounting point as it relates to not being able to recognize revenue, not being able to offset the required liability for an additional month.
What they would, because you'd have a budget signed by the governor sometime in April, generally, that they would know from April until October, they would know exactly how much money was coming in. And if this was implemented, the first year you would just design a budget that included past the fiscal year, which would include July, August, and September. So you'd have a 1-year budget, annual budget that had an extra quarter on it to do that. But it wouldn't seem to me to make any difference whether you split the funding year on the front side or on the back side. And the revenue, the tax revenue you're talking about, unless I'm fooled, I believe generally they set the levy in the spring or summer, fall at the latest, and begin send out tax notices and have them in by January 1. I think some school systems are still on a calendar year, fiscal year, aren't they? All of them have changed to.
I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
So they're all in the state fiscal year. I do agree with your point in that there would be ways, and I appreciate that comment because we'd be very happy to work with you all to make sure that it would be structured. The point is that from an accounting perspective, there needs to be the certainty of that budget. And in my thought process, if you start school in August, which a lot of them do, you're starting to make payments for this year. You still have 2 months worth of last year's residual payments, and the fiscal year hasn't started until October. So maybe I just need to help. Maybe I can just better understand how that would work.
Some people in the room, I know Mr. Burkhalter signed change the school year back to September 1 or something. I think maybe this would help with that.
Any questions, more comments from members of the committee? Chairman Harble.
Scott, right now open enrollment is October, correct, for school systems?
I'm sorry,
for the teachers, the open enrollment system is October, is that correct? For healthcare, the teachers when they're
for healthcare, yes.
For all their open enrollment?
Yes.
Now, so that adjustment is made during the fiscal year or during the school year?
Well,
because if they make the choices, that will adjust some.
Isn't December when they're talking about too? Well, it is October, and my point would be that perhaps you could talk to DCH because I know State Health Benefits is looking at some direct pay, and there may be some consideration of the timing there, and I'd rather defer to them. Currently, the open enrollment, the employer share.
Because they've changed the calendar year to a calendar year on our health care plan.
Right.
So they're going through open enrollments in October. So there's adjustments made there, aren't there, with the school systems as far as the impact to their budgets?
In for the employer portion.
Right.
Right. So the employer portion follows the fiscal year. The calendar year would be a contribution by the employee, which is about 25% of the bill.
Okay. So, but there are some adjustments having to be made then because of that happening in open enrollment being in October. And that's in the middle of a fiscal year.
There would be some adjustments, and again, I think it would really be we follow DCH. We'd have to defer to what State Health Benefits would mandate. Currently, it's October, and I know they're looking at some other things. So
really, whenever we have the fiscal year, there are always going to have to be some adjustments throughout. whenever fiscal
Well,
year
we could
starts.
probably, I don't want to say never. You all could probably structure something and we could help you, but currently I think there would be a big exercise in figuring out how to
But I mean,
deal with any
I'm saying
uncertainty.
that happens now, and if we change, you're still going to have it. So
That's correct.
It's
It,
not
it would make it better.
It's not that
not
having
worse.
it now.
As it relates to the health care, which is about 28%, it would make it, I think it would make it better to go to October. So there are certainly some benefits to doing this. I didn't want to just come out of the gate with the negatives, but in the interest of time, I thought I'd point out the two areas that we thought would be most problematic. Another benefit, of course, would be that by having the fiscal year end on the same date, the grant period, currently we have grant periods where we typically end in end of June, by July 1st. And then there's that period from July 1st to September when the actual federal grants end. And so we mechanically manage that so that we reauthorize and we reallocate it so that they can continue to spend. That would actually be made better by this if you had a clean date of end for both the state and the feds.
Okay, thank you.
Scott, thank you. As I understand it, then for our notes, those are the two, I guess, concerns you would have, and I echo what Mr. Coleman and Mr. Burkhalter have indicated about as we move the starting date of our school years closer to July, which I think we actually had some systems begin in July this past year. It makes it more difficult even with the current fiscal date we have, if you think about it that way. So perhaps that by changing the fiscal date of the year, this might encourage them to move that date a little closer to the fiscal date for economic purposes. So any other comments you have?
It might, but I'm not authorized to discuss that part.
Understand. Thank you so much for coming, Scott.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Appreciate it. It would be real nice. Our next speaker is Mr. Tom Daniel with the Regents. We're glad to have you here, Mr. Daniel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim Flowers is handing out some information to you and your staff. I appreciate the opportunity, and I will be brief and direct. I do assure you that Speaker Coleman is correct about one thing, and that is that I get up every morning thinking about you all day long. And I do that regularly. I think if you ask me the question of can you change the state's fiscal year, my answer is certainly yes, you may. If you ask me should you change the state's fiscal year, I would say respectfully that you should not, based on two key points. One is 46 states share our current fiscal year of July the 1st to June the 30th. And you can see in our handout there the 4 other states. And obviously those 4 other states do operate and operate to varying degrees of efficiency and effectiveness. So as you would know, we all can't say that any one period is absolute. The second point is one that is tied into the operations of the university system, which you so graciously give 11.5% of your money to the university system, and we're very, very grateful for that. Is that at the present time, our academic calendar, which runs from mid-August to mid-May, is within the confines of one fiscal year. If we move to a fiscal year beginning in October, of course, our academic year would then be in 2 fiscal years. Now, that is not an insurmountable opportunity. Obviously, we would figure that out. We would figure out a way to fund the institutions, and we would figure out a way to pay people and to keep operating. But if you ask us, we would say that it would be easier for us to operate within that one fiscal year. That's our report to you, submitted in the same spirit in which you're asking us to supply information for you. Be assured that we'll work with you on the decision that y'all make.
Tom, all right, you said the calendar year or the academic year falls within the fiscal year currently.
Yes,
but
sir.
you have at all of our institutions, I believe, some type of summer.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes,
Used to be called quarter, but semester, whatever. Is
correct. I mean, we're
what year does it fall in?
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jim.
My summer semester begins around the first week of June and ends the first week of August. Those operations are typically reduced in terms of physical capital and faculty members. So it's not as much management goes on the summer.
No, I understand, but the contracts or all the things that the planning for that semester, can I call it that summer school, lack of a better term,
correct,
has to fall within one of the fiscal budgeting years.
Oh, yes, sir.
You're either putting it in the budget year that just completed, June 30th, or you're putting it in the next one. I mean, it's got to go in one or the other.
Yeah, we're normally funding our summer school out of the fiscal year that just ended.
So you, to a certain degree, you have a split funding year now.
Oh, I mean, for summer school, yes, sir. But, yes.
Okay. Members of the committee. Chairman O'Neill.
Tom, just so I can understand your letter. The last two bullet points, the last one, accounting closeout while beginning year activities are at a peak. I need to know what you mean by at a peak. And gathering.
One of the things that we did think of is this is the cycle which you're all very familiar with now that the agencies already operate under, and that is when you adopt your budget in, say, July, it's signed in April, the agencies are hustling to complete that fiscal year. We're anxious to start the new fiscal year in July the 1st, but we're also planning for the budget submittal to the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, which is normally due prior to September the 1st. So that's that perfect storm that you hear some of the state agency budget people refer to. But as we did realize in our internal discussions, if you happen to move the fiscal year, you're still going to have that convergence. But obviously it would be a little bit different in that since the General Assembly will always start on the second Monday in January, state law requires right now that the budget's request be turned in to the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget by September the 1st, that we would still have to be doing that planning. It would be different. But I mean, that falls back on my first point. And if you ask me, can you do it? I mean, I have to say, yes, you can, because I mean, we're certainly going to figure out a way to get it done.
Okay, just a second. I know Chairman Harmon has a question too. Right above that, you talk about academic year reports versus fiscal year reports.
Yes.
We're talking about, as I understand it here, changing the fiscal year. Where is there a difference between academic year reports and fiscal year reports?
Occasionally when we're submitting information to the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget or one of your extraordinarily good staff people, they need to know whether that's on a fiscal year or an academic year period. I mean, we would normally give information, like a graduation rate or a retention rate would be based on an academic year, whereas our fiscal information tends to operate off of a fiscal year. But that really is an issue with almost point number one, that when you look at data from all 50 states right now, you've got the same measurement for 46 of them. So, you don't have to take allowances for there was bad weather in one state at a different period of the year and something happened, and why does that jump out at you? But that's something that y'all have to deal with now. But it was information that we wanted you to have.
Chairman Hart.
Thank you. Tom, good morning.
Hello, sir.
Or good afternoon. Quick, just want to go back real quick. You said that you're planning now in September for January to have it ready for us, but you're planning for your July budget, correct, for that begin date of July? The September numbers you're turning in are for the following fiscal year, which begins July.
Yes, sir.
So really, if we were to change the fiscal year begin dates, you would probably actually be planning in May or June or somewhere in there. You'd have to have it in time for that. It doesn't really matter when the legislature meets. It's just you're planning for that. So we'd actually probably be planning at a little less hectic time, wouldn't you, in June?
It could be. I mean, one of the things that we thought of is obviously when we're working in that May, June, July period to submit our budget requests to the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget by September the 1st, the beginning of that fiscal year is 9 months away.
Right.
Whereas if you move your fiscal year, you're actually going to be having to plan a little bit farther in advance.
Right.
You're going to have your crystal ball's going to have to be a little bit sharper because that period of time will be a little bit longer. But I mean, after 9 months, 10 months, 12 months, I mean, probably it's not a significant planning period to plan for 12 months as compared to 16 months, but it would be something that the economists and your advisors would have to take into consideration.
Right. Well, we have a lot of smart people that I'm sure could do that, but the key to that, though, is I just want to point out it's really probably a less hectic time because when you'll be planning that budget, you won't have that perfect storm you spoke of earlier. Now, what percentage of the Board of Regents' budget comes from the general appropriations?
You're currently giving us $1.9 billion, and our overall operations budget is $5 billion.
So we're at about 20%. We fund about 20%. Is that right? 25, somewhere in there?
Mm-hmm. 2 out of 5, yes, sir.
Well, okay, about 39. I'm sorry. So the rest of it is brought in from tuitions, brought in directly from the Board of Regents. It's directly appropriated by you.
We have tuition is certainly a significant amount of that we bring to the table. Then we would have what we call our auxiliaries, which is where we operate our bookstores, our dormitories, our parking decks. We do have private fundraising that we contribute to the operations of our institutions. Plus, we do have the federal funds, some of the money that comes to us in research grants and contracts. Some of it's Pell money that would be considered scholarships. And then a lot of our institutions do receive some money from the federal government through the various programs.
Right.
But those are usually for designated purposes.
But you don't know what those federal dollars are until October budget is set, until the budget is set by the federal government in October. Is that correct? So
That's
you have a
correct.
plan for those as well?
We are, and we do.
So this would still in some way just kind of match up some of the planning you're doing today?
I mean, it goes back to that point, yes, sir. I mean, we're going to have to project the dollars one way or the other. It goes back to my, first question. Can you do it? You certainly can. I'm not going to sit here and tell you can't do it.
Thank you, Tom.
Speaker Pro Tem. Tom, thanks for being here today.
Yes, sir.
Nonetheless, and probably a repetitive question, but about planning and forecasting a little bit. And what percent of your funds are federal? Just curious.
We're receiving approximately $800 million now in contracts, grants. Some of that would be competitive, like where the University of Georgia Tech, because of your funding of the Coverdale building or the nanotechnology building, some of that would just be money that comes to us as programs. So it's about $800 to $1 billion in federal money.
And Congress, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't they, in their budget process, don't they have their 13 annual appropriation bills actually reported by the spring? Oftentimes, of course, Congress doesn't pass the budget and has continuing resolutions and does things a little differently than the states do. But are you not playing a pretty good guessing game on $800 million as well as to if in fact it's going to be there? And I mean, so you have a similar set of guesstimations you're doing, whether it's
whenever the fiscal, yes, you're always having to project and plan accordingly. Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, sir.
Anyone else on the committee? Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let me, if I could, members of the committee and those who listen, I'm going to sort of think out loud, which I know is dangerous, but if the General Assembly, obviously constitutionally, is mandated to come in January, therefore the time frame in which we meet and debate and set the appropriations in the budget is not going to change. The actual fiscal year of the state then is only when those monies are actually released back to the agencies and the various recipients of those funds. That's basically what we're talking about. So in terms of the planning of getting your information, that's not going to change necessarily.
No, sure. I may be completely wrong about it. It would seem to me that I made casual mention of it a while ago, that the amended general or the supplemental budget process would be the impact of it or the need for it would be somewhat lessened, because you'd only have 2 months left in the fiscal year before the legislature met again, which means the good agencies are good planners and good where no crisis arises or no unexpected problems come up, where now they basically simultaneously plan for the amended general and the regular budget during the same process. Isn't that right, Charlie? I mean, their amended general process, they start thinking about requesting money for amended general at the same time they start talking about planning for their next fiscal year budget because of the time constraint.
One of the concerns has been, and both Mr. Coleman and Mr. Harbin here has both shared the appropriations, as the budget for this state grows, and it is growing tremendously at $18.5 billion. Am I close now? The ability of a part-time legislature in a compact period of time to go through both an amended budget and then the full budget cycle is getting more and more difficult. I know the 3 members of the current House Budget Conference Committee can attest to. It puts pressure on both chambers for us to get the governor's budget in, the House to go through the process, first on the amended budget and then the big budget, and get it to the Senate and then get it through the conference process continues to be a problem. And whether the legislature takes action to change its fiscal year or not, that's going to continue to be a problem that eventually we're going to have to take some action or do something to address, or we'll simply be doing nothing up here but doing budget work. So I think that's also driving a part of this process as well. Our next speaker is from DHR, Ken Jones. Ken, I know you're here.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, let me, on behalf of B.J. Walker, say it's a pleasure to come and speak to you today on changing the fiscal year. I don't have much to add to the conversation from the prior people who've spoken today, but the one thing we can say is that there probably would, from a federal reporting or state reporting, that probably would be a good thing to switch the year for that purpose. However, as we've talked about internally in the department, that's the only gain that we would have. And let me give you one example that we have. In DHR, we have about 1,700 contracts. And they're not all based on the federal fiscal year or the state fiscal year. So really what you got is a combination. If all those contracts that are on the state fiscal year get moved to the federal fiscal year, we are bombarded with 1,700 contracts to get reviewed, renewed in a timely fashion. And that can be a problem when some people question our timeliness now with the contracts currently going on. So looking at one of those issues there. Also, the problem that we have is with the federal government, and Mr. Coleman mentioned it earlier, was that even though they passed the budgets in October 1, a lot of times the resolutions aren't passed or official until sometime throughout the year. So again, as far as changing the fiscal year for the state, I don't know if that's going to change anything, because a lot of times when they pass those budgets, it's not effective October. There are some, for our grants, I'm not sure about the other agencies, but some of ours, they may have it effective at a particular point in time that they approved it. such as some of the action that took place in the DRA last year. We had plenty of those. Some was in February, some was June, some was July, some of those kind of things. So again, just changing the fiscal year wouldn't make any adjustments to improve our position in those kind of activities. Other than that, that's really, I think, Mr. Daniels and Mr. Austin, I can pronounce his name correctly, I think they really kind of pointed out some of the issues that we have as an agency. You know, we do rely on a lot of federal money. About approximately 50% of our budget is federal money, about $3.5 billion total. So we do rely on them heavily. But again, just in the fiscal year, I think wouldn't really improve our position as far as administrative adjustments.
All right. Any questions for Department of Human Resources? Cole?
Thank you.
How you doing?
When is your cost of living raise effective, generally?
Well, I think it's been adjusted to January now. The last year or two has been January.
How much now? I know you have a separate category. I assume you still have a separate category for per diem fees and contract?
Yes.
How much is it?
Top of my head,
over $20 million at one time, and that was before the contract with no.
Oh, well, contracts got separated out, so the contracts is way over $300-400 million in contracts. Yeah. Per diem, I can't remember that number top of my head.
The 300, the contracts were basically.
Yes.
So,
right.
which meant if you change the fiscal year, then you'd have to go through and maybe renegotiate all those contracts, or at least change them somewhat.
Yes.
The terms of the contract.
Yes. Through the negotiation period.
It would be a good thing for the legislature to see where they are.
Okay, good friend Dan Ebersole's here. Dan, come on. Running ahead of schedule, that makes everybody happy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here. The Office of Treasury and Fiscal Services is the state's bank. Agencies collect money, they remit the money to us, we invest it short term, and we give it back to the agencies to spend. That's our reason for being here. We're bound by the Constitution, which says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury except by appropriation by law. You all pass the budget, then OPB allots the money, and as soon as an allotment is provided, that's the authorization for the agency to draw down the money from us. So it really doesn't matter when the fiscal year starts from the operational side. So I don't have a dog in this fight. Will, just in the spirit of the other presenters, express one concern, and that is to think about the transitional. When you go from July to October, there's going to have to be either a 3-month transitional fiscal year or a 15-month transitional fiscal year. I think you would want to go to 15 months, because if you go to 3 months, you'll have all these 3-month contracts, and we get into all the issues about multi-year contracting and restrictions. But other than that, as long as an agency is authorized to draw down the money, we give it to them. Thank you.
You feel strongly both ways, then I mark you down for that. State Accounting Office, Lynn Belinga, or there's Lynn.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, some of the points I'll make will be similar to those that have been made by other presenters, but I'd like to throw some of the issues that we would see with changing the state's fiscal year. Of course, the accounting systems are configurable, can be set up to have a fiscal year as you define, but it would create the transition that's been discussed, and that would require some lead time and some testing. So you would have to have at least a year, lead time to make that change, to identify how the impacts of having a 15-month or a 3-month year, because accounting systems aren't used to having 15 months and 3-month years. So that transition period would be an impact. But as far as setting that's a configurable item in the accounting system. The other thing that I would like to point out are some of the impacts that I see from not having the legislative session consistent and in a similar order. The budget process is a sequence of events, as you all know. And I'll start with the closeout of the fiscal year, and then That closeout process is happening right now from June through, as of last year, through the end of December when we finalize the audit. If you switch that and do not switch legislative session, then you would be doing closeout of the budget during the same time the legislature is in session. So the auditor's time and many of the agencies' time, who also are required to be involved in the budget process in legislative hearings, would also be very concentrated on closeout process. And then it's not an easy process. It takes a lot of time and effort on everyone's part. So you have a real conflict of ability to do the same thing and everything at once when it comes to closeout. You'd be overlapping a fairly significant period of time. Also, the closeout, many of the agencies, of course, want to have the prior year's numbers before they finalize their budget request that they submit to the governor. This would be, of course, not possible if you didn't change the legislative session, because they would be required to submit budget information before they had the current fiscal year closed out, which gives, again, less data to make your decisions on to request your next fiscal year cycle. So you wouldn't have this current information. We found this year, with some of the challenges we had of implementing a new system, delaying that process had a significant impact on our agencies being able to complete and finalize their budget submissions. So we know from experience that that's not a good thing. Of course, people need time for these overlapping issues. The appropriation bill, of course, we need time to get that set up and prepared and put into the budget system and the county system for budget monitoring. And of course, if you didn't change the fiscal year, we'd have a lot more time to do that. So I guess that would be the one plus side, is you'd have much more time to get your budget prepared. So I think it's important that we consider all the sequence of events, not just the budget preparation, but the closeout of fiscal year, the audit process. I might just point out, right now, historically, I'm not sure that it's completely true now, but historically, governments have been in kind of a low cycle for CPA firms, and some of our entities are audited by CPA firms. You would put them into a different cycle for the CPAs that support them, which may put more demands and more availability, may be more questionable because you put them into the tax season. A lot of fiscal year ends for corporations or calendar years, so they would be competing for resources in a different section of the year, which I can't tell you will be more expensive, but it certainly has a potential of increasing audit cost. And of course, there's the issue of coordinating fiscal years. We report as a state entity many authorities, regional education service agencies, the REISs, and the foundations with colleges and universities, all of which currently have fairly consistent fiscal years with the state of July through June. If we changed, we would have a similar situation. They would either have to change or we'd have inconsistent fiscal years. And not that we can't report inconsistent fiscal years. The county standards do allow us to include fiscal years from part of the reporting entities that end on a different time. But it does create challenges in coordinating that and complicates that process a little bit. And some of those agencies you may be able to control, some of them you may not. The foundations, of course, are controlled by boards, and they decide when their fiscal year is. So that has an impact and hopefully would be coordinated if this were changed. And each one of those would have the accounting issues and the cost or not a cost or whatever cost might be involved with that transition period as well. One of the other points I thought would impact our agencies was that currently when an agency closes out the state fiscal year, they have to worry about closing, all they have to worry about is the fiscal year closeouts, quarterly reports for federal reporting. But if we move them to be consistent, then they would, the same staff that is closing out, or maybe not the same staff in every agency, but very similar workloads, increases would be impacted as there, because you have to do all of your closeouts, as was mentioned by one of our departments, your contract renegotiations, close out of the state fiscal year and close out of the federal fiscal year, making it much more difficult to have timely financial reporting. You would have so much workload that it would be much more difficult to complete all of the tasks in that one short time frame. Those are some of the key points I thought would be important. to make on the impacts I think it would have on the state. Thank you.
Office and Planning Budget. Y'all hear Susan? They here yet? OPB? Just, I guess they're interested. All right, that's good. Community Health, Carrie Summers. Community Health. Is Community Health here yet? All right. What about Transportation, Jamie Simpson?
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm Meg Perkle. I'm not Jamie Simpson, and I'm the Director of Administration at the Georgia Department of Transportation. So thank you for the opportunity to comment on these pros and cons of the possible change in the state fiscal year. And I hope the information I provide will be helpful to your study. Before I get into the pros and cons, I just want to mention that although approximately 63% of our current annual budget is federal funding, there's really no big advantage to the department in changing to the federal fiscal year. And this is due to the unique nature of how federal transportation projects are funded, and I'll explain briefly. Federal transportation levels are appropriated in multi-year transportation acts, and so we're easily able to budget, and we have a good idea of how much federal money to expect on an annual basis. The typical transportation project spans several years, so federal funds obligated in one fiscal year can take many years to pay out on a certain project. And the bulk of our federal funds we receive on a reimbursement basis after we have paid the expenses. We don't receive the money up front. Finally, federal transportation law allows us to advance construct, and that's a term in the law, projects temporarily by pre-financing the federal share with non-federal funds. So this allows us to bridge that 3-month gap between the end of the state fiscal year and the beginning of the federal fiscal year, and we don't have to wait for the federal fiscal year to start in order to begin obligating funds in that fiscal year. It's sort of a little pre-finance method we can use to bridge that gap. So for these reasons, the current gap doesn't really impact how we do business, but if we were to change fiscal years, I'll briefly discuss a few of the pros and cons. The first issue I have for consideration, which is not really a pro, but it's kind of a neutral impact, that if we were to change fiscal year, the current congressional district balancing law would not be impacted because that is based on the calendar year when the congressional districts are adopted. So that's good that that would not be impacted. Some more issues for consideration, and I'm going to go in a little bit different order than the handout I gave y'all. Some of the first things that would probably be expected by all the agencies going through the transition is that a new fiscal year would impact accurate comparisons of historical data from fiscal year to fiscal year, as well as quarterly data. And since Georgia Department of Transportation's work is very seasonal, our quarterlies do vary greatly within the fiscal year. All offices within the department would have to do a lot of reprogramming and rewriting of software and reports and queries, and this would require a significant amount of effort and may delay the availability of some reports and information in the transition. Also, one of the major impacts that it would have is the Statewide Transportation Improvement Program, which is our STIP. It's a document that's required by federal law, the fiscally constrained program of projects. It's published annually, and the development cycle is based on the state fiscal year. And when we develop the STIP, it involves a lot of coordination with local officials, our urbanized areas, the MPOs, the Federal Highway Administration, et cetera, and it also involves a lengthy public involvement process. And we coordinate the development of our STIP with all of our large urban areas, and they develop their own, what they call their TIPs, their Transportation Improvement Programs. So transitioning to a new fiscal year would involve a substantial transition in that whole development process and would also require all of the MPOs to change how they develop their local programs. And this may impact some project schedules in the transition year for at least one quarter. And finally, there are a few budgetary issues. Additional funding for the state general funded programs within Georgia DOT would have to be approved in the budget to cover the additional 3 months in the transition year, because we don't have a surplus of general funds to cover that extended quarter in the transition year. And currently, our budget is only less than 1% of our total budget is state general funds at this time. Also, because our budget is built off the previous year's motor fuel tax collections, additional funding for personal services, regular operating expenses, etc., in the dedicated motor fuel programs would have to be approved in the budget to cover that additional quarter during the transition year, because we only collect for that 12-month period and then we base our budget for the next year on that. So there would be a budget shortfall of a quarter of our annual expenditures in that transition year that we would have to work out how to bridge that gap. So although we do have a few more cons than pros, the department has basically a neutral stance. We'll work it out however we have to, depending upon the legislation. So, any questions?
Questions? Let's call it. No, go ahead.
If the next legislature changed, just for the heck of the question, change the way that you collect motor fuel taxes from a per gallon to a percentage basis, how would that affect your? How would that affect the department, the way you fund projects and the way you set aside money?
Well, currently, a big part of our budget is the federal funds, and then it's matched with the motor fuel that's been collected in the previous year. So if they change how we collected the money dedicated to transportation, it would depend on the legislation, and I think if it's a sales tax, I have no idea. It would depend on what's changed, if we still had motor fuel or not. So do you have any other comments about that, Angie? Yeah. We're looking at different options as to how we're currently funded and how we would bridge that gap if we were to change the fiscal year. And if that does happen, then we'll certainly figure out the best way to do that.
Thank you, Chairman. The issues you spoke of here on the cons, those are one time, right? Just during that transition year, most of these.
Yes, sir.
Collecting the historical data, you'll adjust all that over time.
Except for the comparisons of historical data. That would just be something that would have to be footnoted in the future when you look back at fiscal years and compare.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. It's one time.
That can be adjusted, and that's something we'll.
Yes, sir.
You say here on item 3, additional funding, state general fund, or the state general funded programs. What amount would that be for those 3 months?
Do you have any idea? Yeah, we can provide it.
We could get that information so we have an idea. I would assume this transition process would be something we'd plan out anyway as we're moving, if we were doing this to move towards that. But those are, to the point again, those are just one-time adjustments. Once we got to a fiscal year that began in October, it would operate very similar to what we do today. You would just be planning your 12 months.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, it seems to me DHR gets a substantial amount of your money from federal funds now, getting almost 2/3 of your money from the feds now. And it comes in these multi-year acts. Those acts are usually what, 2 to 5 years?
Transportation is usually 6 years.
6 years. And we get monthly reports, revenue reports on collections. It just seems to me if you're collecting 2/3 of your money from a calendar that's not the state fiscal year, it would be advantageous for you to be hitched to a federal budget year, particularly when you can forecast out 6 years in advance and have funding bridges, as you say, to accommodate any hiccups along the way.
I guess the way we do business now, we don't have any disadvantage to not being on the federal fiscal year. But again, we're neutral on it, and you're right. There are some, once we would transition, it would be fine, but probably wouldn't impact how we do business on the day-to-day basis.
Okay, thanks.
Well, actually, this question will be directed to you, but maybe our state accountant might also take a shot at this. To follow up on what Chairman Harmon said, obviously I think every agency is going to have a lot of one-time adjustments to make. Is it possible for us to get a price tag on at least maybe generically those one-time adjustments, and possibly are there any savings by the contemporaneous close of the fiscal years being federal and state to set off against that? Could we get an accounting for the actual cost of doing this statewide? Would that be a doable possibility? Probably easier from your perspective than any other, since you all probably have more long-term data available that you don't have to guess at than any other agency we have.
We haven't evaluated that yet. We certainly could, and try to get you an idea of what the price would be from a GDOT perspective. Certainly, I can't answer for the rest.
I'm not sure how doable it would be, but some of the points were made by some of the departments were had renegotiated all the contracts. We haven't received any department that we can make those kind of estimates. As far as county system changes, we have to, that would be a matter of testing. You know, we can probably get some estimates on some of the internal aspects. Well, we see if there's any impact or more of a magnitude question is on whether or not it increase all the cost or not. Right now, that's just a question that we have to answer. They check and see if a period of time makes any difference. But the biggest impact would be some of the agency systems or subsystems might be changed. So it would be a fairly massive information gathering process. It's not sure how quickly that would turn.
We typically get a fiscal estimate when there's got to be a fiscal impact on bills that we pass. That generally comes from the state auditor's office, or at least under that auspices. Do you feel like, as a state accountant, now that it would have been very unfair a year ago to ask you this question de novo when you got here, but now that you've kind of gotten your arms around it, and by the way, done one whale of a great job for us, would this cost estimate be realistic? I mean, could we, if we chose to do this, would we get an adequate fiscal analysis that would contemplate all these one-time potential adjustment costs? And maybe that's another way of asking the question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Kerry. I thought I saw. Did Community Health or OPB show up yet? There's Community. Come on, Kerry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's an honor to be here to testify before you today on this issue. I'm passing out a what I think is hopefully a succinct memo, which is hard for our department to do since everything we do seems to be pretty complicated. But I think surprisingly this issue we too are relatively neutral on. I've tried to put out or lay out for you a combination of what are the advantages, at least from our perspective, and then what are some of the disadvantages that you may want to consider. On the advantage side, and we are presuming that the General Assembly's appropriation process continues as it is. That is, y'all meet January through March, April time period. One of the major advantages of that is that agencies will have a longer period of time to actually implement budget items that are mandated in the Appropriations Act. And in particular, any of those items that require procurement, I think gives agencies a much longer time period to go ahead, develop that procurement, go through that process, which can be time-consuming, and then have the appropriate amount of time to be ready to implement at the beginning of the fiscal year. I know at least for our agency, many times when we do budget items that require such a procurement, for very big ticket items, we end up requesting those items not be effective until, say, January or sometime in the middle of the state fiscal year, because we are trying to accommodate for that lead time that is necessary between the point in time that the General Assembly gives us our marching orders and the point in time that the item is ready to go or the initiative is scheduled to be implemented. The second thing, and this is pretty specific to us, and unfortunately we had to deal with this one other time, and I hope it'll never happen again, but we ran out of money a couple years ago. I'm sure you all probably remember that. On the Medicaid side, waiting for a supplemental budget to be considered passed and then signed. And I think that certainly it is never our intent to be in that situation again. That was sort of unusual circumstances that particular year. But certainly by having the state fiscal year start in October, I think it gives us an opportunity for more time to take a look at that. And in the event that something like that is anticipated to occur somewhere down the line, we don't get to the crisis point where we're literally suspending payments to providers or just not paying them, which I'm sure nobody, I know myself in particular, would not want to be put in that position. And then item 1C is talking just about more from a selfish side of things, is for financial management staff that are working on both preparing, well, we're really doing 3 years of budget at a time. We're not only closing the fiscal year that we're in, we're starting the next fiscal year, and we're planning for the following fiscal year. So certainly that 3-month delay would allow us more time to focus on our budget development during the summer. As far as our relationship with our federal agency, and we're primarily, as you know, dealing with the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, that funds both the Medicaid and the Peach Care for Kids program. I think there would help to eliminate any kind of confusion about what fiscal status is in relationship to those programs. And I'm thinking particularly of the Peach Care for Kids program, the SCHIP program, where there's dollars that are allotted to us on a federal fiscal year basis. And I think we've reported to the Appropriations Committee before concerns about us running out of federal dollars, and in trying to communicate some of those issues to the congressional delegation, there has been some confusion in the past on whether we're talking about a state fiscal year deficit or a federal fiscal year deficit. Certainly CMS is only interested in the federal fiscal year, and I think when we communicate to a congressional delegation, that can get confusing. So it would certainly align those kinds of discussions. The third thing we wanted to point out are just some administrative efficiencies, and primarily related to reporting. We are reporting to the federal government quarterly for Medicaid and SCHIP and Peach Care for Kids dollars. We're not only submitting a quarterly projection of what we think we will need for allotment purposes, but we're also then submitting quarterly cost reports to tell them here's what we have spent and here is the reimbursement that we are requesting for the federal share of those expenditures. So the fact that we do it quarterly really doesn't make a lot of difference of whether we're reporting quarterly on a state fiscal year basis or a federal fiscal year basis. There are some things that, because of our accounting system being state fiscal year, we do have to make some conversions, and I think the advantage for us is, well, number one, we wouldn't have to make those conversions, and that certainly would reduce the opportunity for error, as well as help us to better ensure that our federal deadlines are met. The other administrative efficiency, which does tend to happen every year in the summer, is as we're closing out our state fiscal year, that closeout period takes a longer amount of time than just a typical monthly closeout. And of course, this year in particular was a little more problematic as we converted to a new version of PeopleSoft, and we were not able to we had a problem with having timely reports to CMS for our April through June quarterly reports. So I don't think we would have that problem, obviously, if we were in line with the federal fiscal year. The last item is really an accounting item related to CMS. They look to us for reports on what are incurred but not reported expenditures. The state has that on the Medicaid on our financial records of how many dollars are out there that we owe, but yet we've not seen a bill for yet. Well, the feds do that too. And right now we calculate one IBNR per year, which is as of June 30th. That's provided to CMS. They would prefer to have one done for 9/30. Frankly, the cost is prohibitive for us to do that. Typically, that isn't a big deal. However, a good example was this year when we converted about 1 million of our members to Georgia Healthy Families, which is a capitated risk-based program, so it's full accrual. So that 1 quarter difference in IBNR really had a big impact on the IBNR reports. So with an alignment of the federal fiscal year, we wouldn't have that issue. On the disadvantage side, again, assuming that we have no changes in budget submission deadlines, we would not have access to year-end expenditure totals nor surplus or roll-forward amounts when we're doing budget development in the summer. For Department of Community Health, that's been very big in the last several years as we have been relatively creative in our health care financing for particularly the Medicaid program. And I see some smiles knowing exactly what I'm talking about, where we've had some prior year surplus that's been appropriated for roll forward and is used in the following fiscal year to cover Medicaid claims benefit expenditures. If we were not able to have access to that information until September, October, our budget development could not consider that, and that's been a pretty important factor. And I think probably, although very important to us, probably more important to the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget as they are analyzing our budget requests and putting together the Governor's budget. The second potential disadvantage is for us projections. We'd be projecting another quarter out and all that. That doesn't seem like much. If you can consider when we are putting in our projections, say, for example, for fiscal year 2008 beginning next July, we're really using data that's at least a year, sometimes a year and a quarter old for projections. If you add another quarter to that, I think our projections may be a little less precise, particularly in our agency where things like population and economic indicators really have a significant impact, and those can change pretty quickly month to month. And then finally, which is sort of a flip side of we wouldn't have a problem with our closing. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, an advantage would be for us, we could be more timely in our reporting for our April and June quarter. One potential issue could be that if we had some reason that we couldn't do closing at the end of September in a relatively timely manner, it could hold up our reporting to CMS, and therefore that holds up their reporting to Congress. So right now we do have that quarter cushion, and because of closing and other things, we have typically taken advantage of that to take a little more time to make sure we get our reports right. So those are some of the disadvantages. Of course, and I'm sure you've already discussed and are certainly aware of, if you were to do the conversion, there would be sort of the one-time cost to get from a state to a federal fiscal year. So we would expect some sort of appropriations bill that would cover that span from July to September. But otherwise, just I guess in kind of summary, I think we're relatively neutral on the subject. We can see both sides, and I think we're pretty flexible.
Questions by members of the committee? Carrie. If Chairman Harbin's figures are correct, and I am confident they are, your department gets the largest amount of federal funds, obviously, your agency, of anyone, and it's roughly 2 to 1 on state funds. I mean, you get about $2 federal for every dollar of state
Correct.
funds.
We're about, for our Medicaid program, we're at about almost 62% federal dollars for every dollar spent, and for the Peach Care for Kids program, it's a higher amount. It's about 73%. So.
Well, and I hear your pros and cons and your advantages and disadvantages, but unless I'm hearing wrong, there would be, for your agency at least, some distinct advantages to this in terms of being able to budget and mark data going forward.
Well, I think it sort of depends on what the federal financial participation rate is. Certainly there's some years where that rate goes up, and the state benefits because we don't have to put as many dollars down to pull down the same amount of federal funds. But frankly, that kind of, there's years that are really great and we make out, and then there's years that the state ends up having to put more federal funds. I don't see, other than that, any particular fiscal advantage one way or the other of where we start in the year, just because we are budgeting on a quarterly basis already, and sort of, which 4 quarters you corral and call your fiscal year is not going to probably matter a lot for us.
All right. Questions? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I believe I saw the Office of Planning and Budget join us. I'm glad to have you here, Susan. Come right ahead.
Glad to be with you all today. Am I last? No? Someone behind me? Okay. From OPB's perspective, I guess we don't really have any advantages that we see in moving the fiscal year, so I'll speak briefly to the disadvantages. I think you may have heard some of them earlier. I think from a system impacts, both on the accounting side and the budgeting side, we would need fairly ample time as well as resources to reconfigure our systems. But more importantly than that, it's hard to envision how the current schedule for other budget requirements could stay the same with the new fiscal year. Currently, the annual operating budgets are due May 31st for the agencies. Our budget recommendation, the governor's budget recommendation, is due the 5th day of the legislative session, and agency budgets are due no later than September 1st currently. So given the amended budget request and the annual big budget request, agencies need time to close their books, which would be September 30th, and then at least, the constraints from an agency perspective are pretty tight right now as they are. They've got a 2-month window after they close the books to prepare their budget requests. We would like to see at least that much time again, which would place the budget request coming in on December 1st instead of September 1st. So again, given that time constraints are already pretty tight in putting the request and the recommendation together, I think if the governor's budget recommendation was then also moved 3 months out, then I think that would place you all in a very difficult position. You all would be towards the end of your session before you got the governor's recommendation. So I don't see how the time schedule can, not the entire schedule, move forward 3 months. So that's the biggest hurdle I think that we see. And then given, I think, the way the mid-year adjustment for schools is typically funded, I think Scott's already spoken to that. So.
Okay. Okay, I'm hearing all these dates, and it's starting to morph together. No, I think I've got the picture, but do I understand you when you say that your May date and then the governor's date submitting the budget, are we planning for a 12-year budget, 12-month of a budget 7 months out of the year? Is that in essence what's going on? We're spending that much time planning and preparing an annual budget process?
Well, the agencies currently, and I think this varies a good bit by agency, so I don't want to speak for all of them, but I think agencies are focused in the summertime currently on closing their books and preparing for the audit. And they have from June 30th currently, when they close out the year, to assess where they were in 06 to determine if there are any needs in the amended budget for the next year. So we're a strong believer, as you know, the governor is a strong believer in an annual budget, but occasionally there are needs in the amended budget. Both that budget request and the budget request for the following fiscal year are currently due by law no later than September 1st. So I think if agencies are not closing their books until September 30th, again, they need time to plan and assess and prepare their requests for the next year. They would need at least the 2 months that they have now. So that would put the agency request not coming in until December 1st. Does that make sense? Whereas currently,
as far as I understand that, but the planning of a 12-month budget, it sounds to me as if it's a majority of the year is involved in planning for the two different budgets.
Yeah, there's a good bit of planning as well as ongoing budget management that occurs throughout the year.
Okay, that's just a comment, really.
Okay.
Don't you make an allocation, quarterly allocation to all agencies?
Allotment, yes, sir.
And you make that allocation at the beginning of the quarter?
Yes, sir, generally. Sometimes more often.
And if the impact or the need for an amended general request is lessened somewhat, wouldn't that give the agencies a lot more time to plan for the full fiscal year? I mean, it would seem that it would. I mean, less concern about making up the difference for 6 months when you reduce that gap from the end of the fiscal year to the time the legislature starts the budget process from 6 months to 3 months. Assuming you move the date of the required submission to coincide, and assuming that all this money we spent over the last 10 or 15 years on software makes it easier for the agencies to close out, it would seem like it would be easier to do, wouldn't it?
Well, I don't want to speak for the larger agencies in particular, but I think during closeout is when they determine a lot of their needs, both on the state and federal fund side, where they ended up short in their various programs or where they were over budget in various programs, which does feed in to having the amended budget be the best and most accurate budget, both from a cut standpoint and from an ad standpoint. I think you take away that opportunity for them to have that closeout data available to them if you keep the September 1 deadline and they're closed 30 days later. They don't have the opportunity of the year-end numbers in order to craft their out-year request. So I think you'll see a request, if the request deadline stays the same, you'll see a request that's less informed by the reality of the prior fiscal year.
Susan?
Yes, sir.
In listening to the comments here today, which I know are sincere and accurate from each agency, but one of the points that keeps coming back is that if we adjust to an October fiscal date, that it's going to cause Office of Planning and Budget and various agencies, they don't have enough time to deal with the data to get correct data or budgeting data. I want you just for a minute, and all of you, to put yourselves in the position of the legislators who are elected and who appropriate the money. We are part-time. We're not full-time. We have limited staffs. And we come up here, and as I think Speaker Coleman said accurately, for the most part, most come in here January. And in a matter of days, not weeks and months, but in a matter of days, has to react to both budget requests from Office of Planning and Budget, representing the governor, as well as additional information from all the agencies, the midterm budget and the full budget, and make informed decisions to actually appropriate these monies in that amount of time. And that is what we're trying to get some feedback on and an appreciation from those involved in this process. That's becoming increasingly more difficult to do. And in the final analysis, we are the ones held accountable for for the appropriation of those monies and the accuracy of that information. And I believe, and I'm just speaking on behalf of myself now, in spite of great work done particularly by this chamber in the past and currently, I believe the legislature is operating at a distinct disadvantage, because I don't think we have the time. We don't have the resources necessary to do it, and I may be misstating that.
That's why they're all smiling.
Of course they are. And I appreciate all the candor and all, but I think what's driving this is our state budget has grown in both size and complexity. The amount of federal funds coming into the state is growing, not diminishing. Would that be a fair statement, Mr. Chairman? In almost every area, whether it's transportation, community health, education, it's continuing to grow. And to get a handle on that, and the fact that there are only 2 other states are doing a fiscal thing now, I don't know really matters, other than the fact that we have to be accountable for what we're doing. And I guess what I've heard to date and what I'm hearing today really confirms why we're sitting here today is, if it puts you at such a disadvantage under that time frame, look at what we have to do. And in the House, we have to get it to the Senate so they can screw it up and get it back in conference so we can get it done. And that's getting harder and harder to do. From the OPB standpoint, though, and I won't put you on the spot, though, it is it's a quarterly allocation of the funds, as Speaker Coleman said, but the planning that we would have to change the date some, obviously, to do it. But that's not something that once it's done, we're still budgeting a 12-month cycle, right?
I would assume so, yes. Except for the first year. I think that's already been discussed. So.
Great. But I think, and my memory's getting worse, but we did something a while back? We had to do a 15-month. Something we had to do something. The health care or something a few years ago. Didn't we do that? And I think we survived. It may have been uncomfortable, a little extra work, but we're all here and the state's running, and I don't know that anyone suffered for it. So it could be done. Is that a fair statement?
Of course, I think it can be done, given the other statutory requirements. I think the other statutory requirements, given due dates for agencies, would need to also be changed in order for it to work.
And I think members...
As well as... I'm sorry.
But those are statutory requirements, so they can be changed.
They can be changed, yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Because we've got people every day that want to change laws up here. So we've got people every day that propose changing laws. So that's something I think is very simple to do if we need to adjust those dates, which I think we're all in agreement. If we were to go forward, that is something we would do, adjust those dates for delivery when those proposed budgets would come in. I recommend budgets.
Okay. Does that include the date of delivery of the budget to the General Assembly? Or the start date of the General Assembly?
Start date is constitutional.
Okay. But that wouldn't be considered?
Don't know. As we're moving through, I guess we'll probably consider everything, but we're just looking at it.
I would say there are 2 issues. There's some constitutional issues, obviously, and there's some statutory issues.
I understand.
Statutory, we're in that business.
I understand.
So the constitutional and other things. Yeah, and if we have to make some constitutional changes and we can make an argument, then we'll take it to the voters of Georgia. I think this past Tuesday there were a number of ballot initiatives on there. So all those things can be done. I guess what I'm getting at, and I know Speaker Coleman has another question, is once we get past the adjustment, we're still dealing with a 12-month cycle, right? And if we change the delivery date in terms of when information is required, and as long as those dates and benchmarks are adequate to what we have now, but it might allow the General Assembly a little more time to examine that data as well.
Okay.
Let's go.
Mr. Chairman, for your sake and leadership up here, especially Ben, just so you'll know, something you haven't experienced yet is an organizational year as majority, where the governor's sworn in and you reorganize and it takes a lot more time and a lot more work. Since Governor Perdue has pretty much got everything, I would assume everything in place, it'll be a little easier. But if, most of you will probably be around when another governor is sworn in 4 years from now, and an organizational year for a new legislature and a new governor, it requires a tremendous amount of work and time on your part and distraction, as you might say. And before the new Constitution was done, before we did it in the late, I've forgotten, 80, early 80, when Busby was governor, the first year of the legislative session was a 45-day session, just for the purpose of organizing, electing your speaker and your majority officers and that kind of thing to prepare. And it coincided, of course, with the new governor coming in.
What did you change it for?
Well, because Busby, the speaker, and Zell were all there, you know, and they were all in harmony. So maybe it'll be all right with y'all this time. But if it weren't for the fact that you could adjourn, you'd be in a tight this upcoming year. You can take those breaks and kind of catch up and prepare. But the Constitution still requires the governor to submit his budget within the first 5 days. As a matter of fact, Hank Huckabee, when he was Zell's budget OPB director, the Legislative Budget Office had to go remind him that he had almost missed the deadline for submitting the budget. So all those things are very important. I'm just saying that this year is going to be especially hard on y'all with the ceremonial aspect, with the change in the fact that you're swearing in the governor again, and it's an organizational year for you. It's going to be very tight. But fortunately, you got the ability to adjourn as long as the Senate works with you or you do this to make up for that. And I think that can also, the fact that you can adjourn to meet some of these deadlines makes the difference too in this submission process and the time for you to do that, to go through the process.
Anybody else? All right, our good friend Charlie Walker is here from the House Budget Office, and we're going to hear from Charlie.
I'll come up here and straighten all of this out here. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for having me here today. And you're right, y'all are at a disadvantage. And the way I see it, all the points that were made today by Lynn and Ebersol was on the fence, but Tom and everybody else, the points, both pro and con, I thought the cons would outweigh the pros considerably, but they didn't. I think it could be done, but I think it's going to put a lot more pressure and make your disadvantage even worse, because when the state auditor and Lynn close the books out, they do it September 30th. This is when the governor is really getting started meeting with his agencies. Now, this year he had the campaign, and so they're under the gun now to really put it in gear to get anything to y'all in a timely fashion. So without it having an impact on moving the legislative session back, I just can't see how that would happen. I can't, because our staff is supposed to be doing the same things that Susan's staff is doing now. We're working on the budget just like they are. But they would, in turn, have to be closing their books out starting September 30th, and that's not an easy job, as any agency person can tell you, as well as going through their budgets and discussing them and negotiating with the governor. Meeting with us would probably just leave us out in the cold. And we're meeting with them. You know, Matt Crawford has a meeting tomorrow with all of his agencies, one-on-one with our analysts. That would be hard to do if they're doing all of these things at the same time. Now, Mr. Speaker, you talked about adjournments and stretching the session out. That could possibly make it work, but I don't see how we'd be in any better position now as a General Assembly and as a staff to get the job done in a better way than we're doing it now by moving the fiscal year. So those are my comments. All of the other comments were valid, and I agree with you. I think if we move forward with looking at this thing, we need to hire a consultant, hire somebody to look at it very closely, get us some good cost figures, and come back to us with some real recommendations on the effects. So that's all the comments I have.
Chairman O'Neill has a question.
Okay. Charlie, thank for those comments. If it were determined that the fiscal year change were maybe not the best method to get more of a parity between the legislative branch and the executive branch, and as I'm hearing things, parity really is equating to more time for review and oversight. Mm-hmm. Could you recommend any other method that would help equalize the deficiency that the General Assembly now admittedly operates under with the rest of state government as we know it today?
Well, it's an interesting question, because the last 2 years, that Mr. Chairman Harbett's been chairman and Jack Hill chairman of the Senate Appropriations, we've been looking at that, trying. There was hope that we could have more input into the budget by changing the appropriations bill to program budgeting and expanding it, but we've had the debates on that. But as far as timeline, Chairman O'Neill, I just don't see that we don't have a good advantage now, and in changing it, I think would just make it worse. I really do. You could hire more staff possibly, but there again, the agencies only have so much time to devote to our staff and devote to OPB. OPB gets first priority this time of year, and then if they're closing out, then Lynn Valingo gets priority. And by the way, if we have to redo a PeopleSoft system again, probably going to have to put some money in the budget for a couple of bodyguards for Lynn, I think. So that's been we've had a tough time this year with that. So,
well, Charlie, let me follow up, if I might, Mr. Chairman. I understand the dilemma that we're under, but I think the answer was it's a hopeless cause, and I don't think we're willing to accept that.
No, I don't.
As a resolution of this committee. To their credit, I'm tired of seeing 3 of these guys on this panel with 4-day beards and no sleep for a week and a half.
Oh, I've been doing it 30 years.
Grumpier than 3 goats, and then you tagging around trying to stay without killing somebody. Even as bright as they are, and they're the brightest we have, there's a certain level of fatigue at which you begin to lose your best day. To me, that doesn't seem like the best approach to this.
It doesn't to me.
And that's caused by what may be an unnecessary urgency created by something over which this General Assembly and the voters that elect us have no control. My question to you is there a better way of doing that if it's not the change of the fiscal year? Is there a way to build time, oversight, and consideration into our system, even if that were to require a constitutional amendment? We're going to kill these guys if we don't do that.
Without having a constitutional amendment, you could probably stretch the session out into April or May, take a break between both budgets, get it done, take a 2-week break, take a month break. But, you that have businesses back home, I don't know that you'd want to do that, but more time means more time spending up here, without the General Assembly counting off days. We used to count the weekends back in the old days where, the session was over at the end of February one year, but the budget was not nearly as cumbersome and large as it is now, obviously. So, anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Charlie, I want to ask for your opinion. Just make a statement. Mr. Chairman and members of this committee, I think that we all understand the 3 branches of government, and if the legislature could get together, House and Senate, and go back to a single budget office, it would make a tremendous amount of difference on the positive side. Not that either house would control it, but the division and the competitiveness and the individuality of House and Senate budget offices has created a tremendous disadvantage for the legislature, and it's not a healthy competition. And I would hope that with a new lieutenant governor and a new maybe a new set of leadership in the Senate to some degree, that y'all could begin to talk about putting those 2 offices together again. If it didn't do anything else, it would ease the budget process. And I can tell you from being appropriations chairman for 12 years and being on the conference committee of the budget for 14 years, that never once did I feel that the Joint Budget Office was more, I guess, more friendly or more supportive of one side or the other. That it was always a healthy relationship and a relationship that was just a good thing for the legislature. So I hope that when y'all move into this process of planning for the session, that you would at least open that up with the new Lieutenant Governor and discuss it. It's absolutely worth it. It would be good for you and good for Jack and for y'all.
Thanks, Speaker. Thank you, Charlie.
Jason, I'll make sure I hire you if that happens.
We're at the point where I want to allow any committee members comments on this subject, and remember that our charge in the study committee is really to report back to the Speaker and our fellow members in the House our findings and any or no recommendations. I think we're all aware that this is not something that will happen quickly, but I believe by having this hearing and having the study committee, what we've done is begin a discussion that not only gives the legislature some benefit, and I think anytime you benefit the legislative process, you benefit the citizens of Georgia, because we are their direct representatives. So with that, I'm going to allow any of the members that want to make any comments or any questions of the people in the audience here one last time to do that. I'll begin with Speaker Pro Tem Burkholder. Terry, you done?
I just suggest that maybe you look at the legislative bodies and talk to the chairman of appropriations and others in Alabama and in Michigan. That you also look at the date, look at the states and their start date, their legislative start date. When you look at the fiscal year ending, that might make a difference. I didn't go back and look at that, but the start date of the legislative session versus the fiscal year would be worth looking at. But the states that do it, I'd certainly talk with the Alabama and Michigan on that deal with that on the same date. I think it'd be worth either asking them to come or y'all going up there or over there.
Chairman O'Neill?
Yeah, what I heard, and I'm not completely clear on it, is that there's some problems that are derivative from some strife that we've created for ourselves, frankly, maybe between the two chambers of the General Assembly in some case, and I certainly acknowledge what Speaker Coleman said in that regard, and we need to do that better. I agree with that entirely. But when we went to zero-based budgeting in this state, I thought that was one of the greatest accountability features ever for the folks that elect us. I thought it was probably as transparent of government as you could possibly have as it relates to our number one duty up here, which is the budget. And I think just by the very nature of that's going to require a lot more time and a lot more oversight, because we're not just rolling over effectively what used to be 5 to 10% of the budget. Dealing with 5 to 10% of the budget and rolling over 90. We're starting with first dollar, presumably at least by design. I think we really need to look at giving our budget oversight folks that we rely on so heavily, like our conference committee and others on the appropriations committee, frankly, even with all the chairmen and the way we're looking at it, bringing them together, a lot more time for oversight than they're getting now. Otherwise, I believe it's just a train wreck, and eventually it's going to get off the track is my concern. I'm not sure at this point that the way to do that is changing the fiscal year. I think what we're going to find out when we look at other states is that a lot of them start their legislative session later than we do, that have the same June 30th close, so that's 6 to 9 months rather than 6 months. And there's probably a requirement of getting the budget to the legislature prior to their even arrival, for oversight and committees. I hope we'll give a lot more consideration to that as we move forward in this very worthy undertaking of understanding how we could better do this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you that came today and offered your insight into our budgeting process. Like Charlie, I was surprised there weren't more cons, and surprised at the neutrality of so many of you. But I think the ultimate goal here is, spoken very well by Chairman O'Neill, is trying to lessen our disadvantage of being forced into passing a budget rather quickly. And we do that by getting more time now, and that's what we're looking at here. How do we accomplish more time for the legislature? Because we are ultimately the ones that are responsible to the people of the state. Whatever we do, we're held accountable to them, and you are buffered somewhat by us. But with that responsibility, we have to make sure we are getting the proper amount of time to pass a budget, to look at it, our oversight, not so much to be adversarial, but just to make sure that what we're doing is what we are telling the people of Georgia we want to do and is in the best interest of the state. So I think ultimately, whether we change the fiscal year or not, I hope what comes out of this study committee is that we develop a way for this body, particularly the appropriations process, to have more input, more oversight, and more information a lot sooner. How we'll accomplish that, I don't know. It may be through changing this, but with the minds that are up here, me excluded, I think we can work on that and probably come up with some really good ideas that look after the General Assembly. This is a House study committee, but it's ultimately the whole General Assembly that is going to benefit from us doing what we're trying to do. And I think in the end, the long run, the people of Georgia will benefit because there'll be more oversight by the people that they're sending up here every day or 40 days to represent them. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's it. And again, I want to thank all of you who came out today.
Thank you, Chairman Harbin, and thanks again to all of you. Let me, as we wrap up here, let me ask the members. And Terry, Speaker Coleman, one of the things about coming in and taking a 2-week break or taking a break in the middle of the session for budget, every time we take a week or 2 weeks off, there's an expense to the members, the rank and file members. Many of the members today have to contract with either an apartment or a hotel for a period of time. And most of those places now require you to pay for through the weekend. I mean, if we're here Monday to Friday and we take Tuesday off to work on a budget, or we take next week off, they're contracted. Now, if you're a committee chairman or you're on the appropriations committee and you're meeting during that time, there's a per diem reimbursement to offset that. But for the majority of the members in our House anyway, and it's not as much in the Senate because I think everybody in the Senate's on appropriations the way I understand it, but in the House, at least the majority of our members then are left with an expense for housing, even though they may not be here, that we either have to make up some committee time for them to come here. And so I know the leadership in the House the last couple of years has tried to be very sensitive to that and try to do our business as quickly as possible and get out of here so as not to expose that. I think you're right. I think we're getting to the point, if we're not there already, where we're going to have to see some significant breaks during the session to allow the budget process to work. I know Ben's doing it full time, but I know from Mark and I's standpoint, with everything else going on, and then let's get in the room for an hour and concentrate on the budget. It's just getting more and more difficult to do that. So I think it's not out of line in our report back is to make some recommendations to the Speaker in the House of how we do that. We're constitutionally mandated to come in the second Monday. We can, by adjournment resolutions, take his breaks, and as long as we get the budget passed prior to the close of the fiscal year, I believe constitutionally we've met our obligation. Now, if there's anybody in the room that disagrees with that, speak up. But I believe I'm correct in saying that, right? The governor has to July 1 to sign the budget. If we didn't pass it, there's X number of days, but
It's almost happened.
yeah. So you see what I'm talking about and going through. So any recommendations that we can bring back, I think, to the Speaker and to the House, and I think the Senate is obviously facing the same problem, would be appreciated. Because we don't have a split session by Constitution. We have an ongoing session. so that when these members come up here and sign in, unless we just start coming in on Monday from a ceremonial standpoint, swearing people in, particularly that first year, and then saying that's it for 2 or 3 weeks except for appropriations, then they could delay their housing arrangements for that number of days. I don't know how you do it, and we continue to ask more and more of our members for less and less, and it's getting harder and harder to ask people to do it, and long after I'm gone, we're going to need to have good people that are willing to donate their time, and particularly those that come from far distances. As you know, it's getting more and more difficult to be 250, 300 miles from Atlanta and come up here on short notice. Any other comments?
Chairman, I would just suggest to you that even members that are not on Appropriations Committee have a vital interest in the budget deliberations. I can recall when I wasn't involved in it at all and in the minority, I still audited every meeting I could get to. In those days at my own expense, but I would remind the chairman very gratefully to the leadership and the chairman here on behalf of the state that we operate this General Assembly 50th in the nation in cost. There's no General Assembly in America that operates more efficiently than this one. And I can't think of anything more important than Georgia's budget from an oversight standpoint for every elected official. And I for one, as a chairman, would be happy to approve per diem for any member, regardless of their membership on appropriations, that would audit these ad hoc meetings. I think, but because of the definition of per diem, they have to stay and work. I wouldn't just give it to them to go home, but those that would have an interest in it, I can't imagine any that wouldn't, frankly, in their sworn duty. That probably is a recommendation that would be worthy of evaluation to be sent to the Speaker, I would think.
So your recommendation is then that during the budget hearing process, whether it's at the subcommittee or full committee level, that any member of the House that attended those committees would receive a per diem day, even though they're not a voting member. John, say that.
Well, let me say something. It's not critical. It's take it for what it is. When you change this session, this is just one thing, but when you change the session beginning on Monday at 1 o'clock, it made it convenient for some people, especially people that live out in the state. They don't come up till Monday, a lot of people. But you also lose a whole day of committee work, pretty much, if you have any part of a session, because Monday usually turned out, if you came on Sunday night, we're talking about less and less people now who live in rural Georgia. As you know, the metro area of Atlanta, and I say the metro area, but north of Macon, the fall line, most of the legislators will come after the next census and the next reapportionment will come from that area north of the fall line. But the driving thing and the days off, because you leave now lots of times you have Fridays off, which means a lot of people feel obligated to go home when their wife or family says, well, you're off Friday, why don't you come on Thursday night? If you do that, you also lose another day of committee meetings. We started, Larry Walker and I pushed hard for Wednesdays off because people were still here. They could spend that day either doing work and or doing committee work. It's something I think you ought to look at. The other thing is that sooner or later, because of the financial cost, you can't raise the salaries much because the public already thinks you're making $125,000 a year. You got to do something on a flat amount of expenses. The fact that you have people that are outside this metro area that come and have to stay, or have to be up here. And if you're involved, you have to be up here just about the whole session. You've got to come up with something like Congress does where you get more money the further you are away from the Capitol to pay your expenses. It's impossible for somebody living in St. Simons. Of course, you're already wealthy, but somebody, a young legislator living on on a small salary, living in Valdosta or Jay Shaw in Lakeland, If Jay wasn't fairly well off, he'd have a hard time serving today. So you've got to look at that. You've got to no matter what people might say, I think you're going to have to say that after we get the budget, we can't just go right to work on it. We got to take a week or 2 weeks off to look at this thing. And let me tell you, OPB would much rather you take time looking at it because they're going to wind up cleaning up the mess that you might leave if you rush through this. So I think it's imperative. And if you do that, then you've got to make an allowance for people that want to stay here, as Larry said, and be involved in the budget. One of the other benchmarks that people look at is how many days of per diem you receive. Well, what they don't look at is your flat allowance, if you have a flat allowance, to living allowance. And I think that's imperative that you come up with something so if you can take off a week or two after the first week, or take, as we used to do, to prepare the budget, and people actually prepare legislation. I mean, here's a guy that just got elected, and he's going to be walking around in the dark for a few weeks. But if he had kind of a break to get his feet on the ground after that first week, he'd have an opportunity to determine what he's going to do about legislation, if any, resolutions, those kind of things. So I think you're going to have to look at the whole process over. And last but not least, those of you that are still around 4 years from now, chances are you may have a governor who has no governmental experience. And what an experience that's going to be for you. We've been fortunate in Georgia that every governor we've had in modern times has had either Senate, House, or both elective or constitutional officer elected experience, which means they slid right in. This governor had years and years of experience and was involved in the budget process in the Senate and knows exactly. But just think about 4 years from now, if y'all are trying to break in a new governor who doesn't know anything about the process, what a disadvantage you'll have and what kind of mess you'll be in. So I would hope from somebody who's leaving, y'all would examine the whole process over. Whether you change the fiscal year or consider changing the fiscal year, you've got to do something about giving Ben and you three people who are on the conference committee and people like Larry who deal with complex tax issues more time to deal with these things. And rushing through the session is not the way. One of the biggest fights I've had, the only real disagreement I've had with Speaker Murphy was about ending the session. We always tried to have a day between the last day, a day before the last day of session. We had to try to take that day so we could be sure we cleaned up less. And he was wanting to go to see the Braves practice. And I was chairman of appropriations, and we actually had a fight over the adjournment resolution. And the truth is we won. We won, and we stayed that extra day, but we wouldn't have finished the budget. They wouldn't have had it prepared otherwise. So I would encourage you to look at all those things. Reimbursement of members and or changing the expense allowance, additional time, and looking at what you're going to do in the future as far as planning for these two budget offices. It's a big deal for y'all to carry on state government.
Well, thank you. Here's what I'm going to ask to do with members of the committee's permission. I'm going to ask with our House research staff to sort of recap in writing the comments made here today, including these that were made as far as things to look at, get to each of you in writing for your notes in the next couple of weeks. Make any changes, additions that you want to make, get it back to her, and then we'll get a final draft for you to sign off on. I'd like to be able for this committee to get this out to the Speaker and to the members of the House prior to the close of the year, so that when we come back in January and the new members of the House, and we do have one of our newly elected members, and I do want to recognize Representative Hannah, who's coming in the back, who's been around a long time from over in Parrott, Georgia, that we take action, that we don't just leave here today, because these are real problems. And the time that's been spent here, the 2 hours this afternoon, may in fact change the overall process up here. And if that's what we need to do, that's what we need to do. Is that okay if we do it in that format? All right. With that, members of the committee, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're dismissed.
Carried.